The phone call came exactly 1 week after Evelyn's passing, shattering the comfortable silence of my small life. Evelyn, my ex-wife and a titan of the real estate world, had left behind an empire worth an estimated $34 million, and her funeral had been a spectacle of wealth and power. But it wasn't the millions that disturbed my peace. It was the cruel, self-satisfied voice of our son, Daniel. He was calling for one purpose only, to relish my complete and utter exclusion. "You'll get nothing, Dad." "Absolutely nothing," he'd sneered, confirming my status as a forgotten footnote in Evelyn's triumphant biography. I was invited to the will reading merely as a formality, a witness to my own irrelevance. But Evelyn, a master strategist even in death, had planned a final, brilliant act of justice, proving that some debts, especially those of principle and pride, demand a far steeper and much more public settlement. The silence of my small apartment had been a comfortable, familiar blanket for the last 20 years. It was a silence only punctuated by the distant clatter of the nearby streetcar, the wheeze of my old window unit air conditioner, and the soft click-click-click of the keyboard when I took on a freelance editing job. But on the afternoon of Tuesday, October 6th, that silence was violently fractured by the shrill, demanding ring of the phone. It had been exactly 1 week since the funeral. Evelyn's funeral. Evelyn Carmichael Jenkins, my ex-wife. The woman who, through a combination of relentless drive, keen financial foresight, and a touch of inherited seed money, had transformed a dusty, local textile firm into a sprawling, multi-state real estate and development empire valued at an estimated $34 million. A fortune I had never touched, benefited from, or even envied, not truly. I picked up the receiver, knowing instantly who it was. Only one person in my life possessed that particular brand of arrogant punctuality, our son. "Mark Jenkins," I answered, using my full name as a subtle shield. "It's Daniel. Did you get the email, Dad?" Daniel's voice, filtered through the cheap phone line, still managed to sound perfectly tailored, like an Italian silk suit. It was cold, precise, and carried an undercurrent of barely suppressed triumph. He was 32 now, a junior partner at a prestigious venture capital firm, and he'd inherited all of Evelyn's ambition but none of her residual warmth. An email about a meeting with Evelyn's estate lawyer, yes. Tomorrow afternoon, in the city. Mr. Harrison's office, I confirmed, running a tired hand over my chin. I had planned to spend tomorrow wrestling with a particularly dense corporate prospectus, but life, it seemed, had other plans. "Oh good. You'll want to be on time," he said. And then the true reason for his call surfaced, bubbling up like rancid oil. "Just so you don't waste your time, or mine, I wanted to tell you now. You'll get nothing, Dad. Absolutely nothing." I didn't react immediately. I took a slow breath, letting the venomous words hang in the air. This was the moment he had been waiting for since he'd learned the true scope of his mother's wealth. Daniel had always resented my modest life, my preference for books and quiet over boardrooms and noise. "That's fine, Daniel. I wasn't expecting anything," I said, trying to keep my voice level. It was the truth. When Evelyn and I had divorced, it was clean. I took my share of the marital assets, our small house and my half of the meager savings, and wished her well. Our divorce decree explicitly stated no further claims on future assets. "Fine." His voice rose slightly in disbelief. "You're sure? Because you've been invited as a formality, as an ex-husband. But the will was finalized last month. It all goes to me, the grandchildren, and a few selected foundations. The lawyers are very clear. There's a tiny fund, a trust, set aside for your continued modest lifestyle, a yearly stipend so you don't, starve in your little box of an apartment. But that's it. Nothing from the actual estate. No property, no stocks, no cash lump sums. The description of my home as a little box stung, but I pushed it down. I understand, Daniel. Thank you for the update. But just don't try any of your old manipulative tricks in front of Mr. Harrison. Don't try to pull the "we were once a loving family" routine. It's over. You're a ghost from her past, Dad. A footnote. He punctuated the insult with a harsh, triumphant laugh that made my stomach clench. He didn't wait for my response, slamming the phone down with a definitive clack. I slowly replaced the receiver and sank onto my worn, corduroy armchair. I hadn't wanted the money, but I felt the heat of humiliation creeping up my neck. Not because of the $34 million, but because of Daniel. He wasn't just relaying information, he was delivering a verdict. Nothing. $34 million, and I was going to be subjected to a public performance where my own son confirmed my irrelevance. Still I would go. I would put on my best, slightly shiny, suit. I would attend. Not for the money, but for the principle of having been Evelyn's husband for 10 years and Daniel's father forever. I would face the lawyer, and I would face my son. Let the boy have his moment of cruel satisfaction. I had survived worse. The offices of Harrison and Finch occupied the entire 35th floor of a prestigious glass and steel tower in the financial district. The air inside smelled expensive old leather, polish, and a faint, sterile scent of filtered air. It was a world away from my little box of an apartment. I arrived exactly 5 minutes early, just as a matter of principle. I wore my dark gray suit, the one I usually reserved for weddings and other somber occasions, which was freshly pressed but betrayed its age with a slight sheen on the elbows. The receptionist, a young woman with a polite, practiced smile, led me down a hushed corridor and into a large, formal conference room. Daniel was already there. He sat at the head of a massive, glossy mahogany table, looking every bit the conquering heir. He was wearing a deep charcoal suit that seemed molded to his broad shoulders, and his silver watch caught the glare of the recessed lighting. He didn't look up, instead tapping furiously on his phone, likely conducting business even in this sacred, final space. With him was his entourage, his 2 adult children, Ethan and Clara, both polished and unervingly quiet, and Amelia Vance, Evelyn's longtime business manager. Amelia, a sharp woman in her 50s, offered me a small, genuine smile, a welcome flicker of humanity in the glacial room, before returning her attention to Daniel. I took the seat farthest from Daniel, near the large window that offered a dizzying view of the cityscape, a vast empire that Evelyn had once commanded. Precisely at 2 p.m., Mr. Harrison entered the room. He was a man defined by neatness, a tailored, pinstripe suit, perfectly parted silver hair, and a pair of half-moon glasses perched on his narrow nose. He carried a single, thick, leather-bound folder. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I am Stephen Harrison, Evelyn's primary estate counsel," he began, his voice dry and professional, devoid of any emotional inflection. He performed the requisite formalities, confirming everyone's identity and establishing the validity of the will and its various codicils. Then he opened the folder, revealing the neatly tabbed pages of Evelyn's last will and testament. Mr. Harrison launched into the dry, necessary recitation of Evelyn's enormous portfolio. It was an inventory of a life lived successfully and ruthlessly. The estate's assets have been meticulously evaluated. The total approximate value stands at $34 million, $34 million US, net of taxes and immediate debts. This value is distributed across the following primary categories. He detailed the list, and Daniel's chest seemed to swell with every number read aloud. Real property holdings, the largest segment, totaling approximately $18 million. This included the primary residence, a magnificent estate in Westchester County, which was earmarked specifically for Daniel's use, along with several large commercial properties in major metropolitan areas, all meticulously accounted for. Securities and investment portfolio, valued at just under $10 million. These were a mix of blue-chip stocks, tech investments, and various low-risk funds, managed with Evelyn's characteristic prudence. This section was divided into several named trusts for the grandchildren, Ethan and Clara. Business equity, the remaining $6 million represented the liquid capital and equipment holdings of Evelyn's founding company, Carmichael Developments. This equity was mostly set aside for charitable foundations focused on women in business, a cause Evelyn had championed fiercely. As the figures mounted, Daniel occasionally offered a curt nod of approval or whispered a technical question to Amelia, reinforcing his role as the master of the proceedings. I sat silently, feeling like a misplaced footnote to a magnificent novel. Daniel was absolutely right. I was getting nothing of substance. Finally, Mr. Harrison flipped a page, signaling the end of the major distributions. He cleared his throat. "And now," he announced, looking down the table, "we come to the matter of Mr. Mark Jenkins." Daniel, who had been relaxed, straightened suddenly. He shot me a look of cold, barely concealed disdain, a silent, "Here it comes, the charity." Mr. Harrison continued, his voice softening slightly as he read from the text. "To my ex-husband, Mark Jenkins, I confirm the establishment of the Mark Jenkins Modest Lifestyle Trust. This trust, capitalized with $500,000 from the general estate, is designated to provide Mr. Jenkins with an annual stipend of $30,000 for the remainder of his natural life. This sum is intended to allow for his continued comfortable existence, free from financial worry, in the manner he has chosen." Daniel couldn't help himself. He let out a loud, patronizing snort that echoed in the quiet room. He leaned over and muttered to his daughter, "See? Pity money. $34 million in play, and he gets the cost of a new car every year." I remained impassive, but the deliberate, public nature of the charity stung deeper than his earlier phone call. Evelyn had set it up to be secure, yes, but its very existence now served as a public measure of my life's modest scale relative to hers. Mr. Harrison tapped the paper, bringing the room back to order. Beyond the trust, Mrs. Jenkins inserted a final, specific item in a codicil added to the will on January 1st of this year. "This is a special, personal bequest." Daniel looked intrigued, then dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "If it's the stipend, Mr. Harrison, we can sign the paperwork now. I don't see the need to prolong this." Mr. Harrison's jaw tightened slightly. "It is not the stipend, Daniel. Please exercise some patience. This is a designated bequest from Evelyn's own hand, and she required its reading in full." He placed a delicate, aged piece of paper onto the table, its edges slightly frayed. He began to read, and the formal, legal language suddenly dissolved into Evelyn's distinct, personal voice. "To my ex-husband, Mark Jenkins, I leave the following. After all these years, you still owe me a debt, Mark. Not of money, but of principle. I remember when we were young and broke, and you swore that if you ever came into a fortune, you'd buy me back the little locket your grandmother gave me, the one I had to sell to pay for Daniel's emergency appendectomy when he was 4. A stunned quiet replaced Daniel's agitation. "A locket? You never got the fortune, but I did. I bought the locket back myself a decade ago. It's sitting in my safety deposit box at the First National Bank, box 449. Along with the locket, you will find a small, sealed blue envelope. Mr. Harrison paused, letting the silence draw out. The atmosphere had shifted from cold professionalism to baffling intrigue. Daniel's face was a mask of confusion. Mark, I leave you the locket as a reminder of a time when we put principle and family first. And I leave you the blue envelope. But there is a condition for the envelope. A secret condition. The lawyer looked up, his expression unreadable, and flipped to the next page, preparing to read the shocking requirement. Mr. Harrison's voice had gained a theatrical quality now, reading from the final, personal section of the codicil. The professional mask had slipped, replaced by an expression of deep, curious intrigue. He looked less like a corporate lawyer and more like an oracle delivering a cryptic message. The silence in the room was so profound that the muffled groan of the building settling outside seemed deafening. Daniel, who had been sneering at the mention of the locket, a mere trinket in his estimation, now leaned forward, his features tight with suspicion. He sensed, correctly, that the triviality of the gift was merely a cover for a deeper purpose. Mr. Harrison continued, reading the final, dramatic lines of Evelyn's testament regarding the bequest. The locket is a gift of memory, but the contents of the blue envelope are conditional. Mark is entitled to the contents of the blue envelope only if he can tell the estate lawyer, immediately and without hesitation, the exact words I used to tell him that I was pregnant with Daniel on the night of our wedding anniversary in 1993. The revelation dropped into the room like a heavy stone. A memory test. A test of intimacy from over 3 decades ago, presented as a legal stipulation in a $34 million will. Daniel was the first to react, his fury overriding any pretense of decorum. He slammed his fist onto the polished mahogany table, the sound sharp and violent. "This is ridiculous," he spat, his face flushing crimson. "Mr. Harrison, you can't be serious. This isn't a will, it's a parlor game. A private joke between ex-spouses. My mother wasn't thinking clearly. That's an intimate moment only he could possibly know. It's designed to exclude me from any challenge." Amelia, the business manager, quietly reached out a calming hand to Daniel, but he brushed her off. He paced to the window, his breath coming in short, angry bursts. "It invalidates the entire bequest. It's a breach of fiduciary duty. You're allowing a private, unverifiable trivia question to determine the distribution of assets," he ranted, gesturing wildly toward me, still sitting quietly at the far end of the table. He could simply guess a sentimental line. Any line. Mr. Harrison waited patiently for the outburst to subside, his expression remaining perfectly calm. When Daniel finally stopped, panting, the lawyer spoke with a sudden, measured authority that demanded respect. "Mrs. Jenkins was of perfectly sound mind when she executed this codicil, Daniel. I reviewed it meticulously with her to ensure it met all legal standards. She wanted this particular condition because it was a highly personal, verifiable moment known only to the two of them. It was, as she put it, her final testament to the shared history that created you." He then held up a second, thinner, sealed envelope. It was marked in the corner, "Confidential answer." "I know the answer, Daniel, because your mother told me the words herself, and I sealed her precise response within this document in front of a notary. It is completely verifiable. This is not a guess. It is a memory test that, if answered correctly, must be honored." The gravity of the situation settled in. This wasn't a cheap trick, It was a brilliantly constructed, legally sound challenge. Mr. Harrison looked directly at me, his gaze piercing. "Mr. Jenkins, the time for the answer is now. The locket and the blue envelope's contents hang upon this. What were the exact words Evelyn used to tell you she was pregnant with Daniel on the night of your wedding anniversary in 1993? The intense focus of every person in the room, Daniel's furious scrutiny, the grandchildren's nervous curiosity, Amelia's professional interest, pressed in on me. The $34 million didn't matter. What mattered now was the memory. My son was betting on my failure. I closed my eyes, retreating from the opulent present back to a tiny, cluttered apartment on the anniversary of our vows. 1993, we were barely scraping by. We'd splurged on a cheap bottle of bubbly and takeout Chinese. Evelyn had been unusually quiet that night, smiling a secret smile as she handed me a poorly wrapped gift. I recalled the scent of the lilies I'd bought her and the feel of the cheap wrapping paper. I remembered asking her, "What is it? Did you find another antique?" And the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed. I opened my eyes, the memory suddenly crystal clear, precise, and vivid. It was a line so characteristically Evelyn, a blend of fierce love, practicality, and her innate, dark humor, that it couldn't be forgotten. I leaned forward, looking past Daniel's glaring face and straight into the kind, skeptical eyes of Mr. Harrison. I spoke the words softly, but clearly enough to cut through the heavy silence. The exact words. The precise moment. She gave me a small, wrapped gift, and when I asked what it was, she smiled and said, simply, "Mark, I just bought you a son and a tax deduction." The moment the words, "Mark, I just bought you a son and a tax deduction," left my mouth, the room froze. It was such an idiosyncratic blend of sentiment and pragmatism, so perfectly Evelyn that it had the immediate ring of truth. Daniel's initial fury was replaced by a look of sheer, cold horror. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, as if I had just recited an ancient incantation. His face, which had been so swollen with confident anger, now seemed slack and defeated. "No," Daniel whispered, pushing away from the table. "That's impossible. That's a random, vulgar guess. A cynical phrase." He couldn't possibly remember an exact, trivial phrase from 30 years ago. "He's lying." Mr. Harrison, however, remained completely unruffled. He ignored Daniel's outburst and focused his entire attention on the thin, sealed document labeled "Confidential" answer. He took a silver letter opener from his desk blotter, carefully slicing through the wax seal with a deliberate, slow movement. The crisp sound of the seal breaking felt louder than Daniel's shouting. He unfolded the paper inside, a small, elegant card written in the same hand that had penned the main will. He held it close to his glasses, reading the contents silently. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Daniel was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically between me and the lawyer. The grandchildren, Clara and Ethan, leaned in, their inherited shares momentarily eclipsed by the drama unfolding over a locket and a strange password. Amelia, the business manager, watched with a quiet, knowing look, perhaps aware of Evelyn's flair for the dramatic even in death. Finally, Mr. Harrison looked up, his kind eyes twinkling with a deep, professional satisfaction. He let out a small, satisfied sigh. "Mr. Daniel," he said, his voice regaining its firm, legal authority, "I can assure you, your mother was exceptionally clear. The wording had to be exact. The note in this sealed envelope states the precise phrase. I must inform you that." He paused for dramatic effect, letting Daniel suffer for a final, agonizing moment. "That is absolutely correct." The confirmation landed like a physical blow on Daniel. He recoiled as if struck, his careful composure shattering completely. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Harrison. He must have found the note. He must have coerced her. You cannot admit this into the will's proceedings." Daniel shouted, turning his wrath on the lawyer, his voice cracking with panic. The immense weight of the $34 million inheritance suddenly seemed less secure. Mr. Harrison stood up, placing both hands on the table. "I understand your frustration, Daniel, but the integrity of the will must be maintained. There was no coercion. Mrs. Jenkins put this codicil in place precisely because she predicted this level of reaction. She wanted to ensure her final personal wishes were fulfilled without argument." He then lifted the tiny blue envelope, the original prize, from his folder. It was small, made of thick, high-quality linen paper, and sealed with an old-fashioned wax stamp bearing Evelyn's personal initial. "Mr. Jenkins," he announced, presenting it to me. "The condition has been met. The blue envelope and its contents are yours, as per your late ex-wife's last testament." My hands were slightly unsteady as I reached for the envelope. It felt surprisingly heavy for a single card. Daniel watched, his face a mask of furious powerlessness. He had failed to stop the inevitable. Ignoring the heat of his gaze, I broke the aged wax seal. The quiet snap of the seal seemed to be the final sound of Daniel's absolute control over his mother's estate breaking apart. Inside was a single, elegantly written card, bearing Evelyn's distinct, sloping handwriting. I began to read, not aloud, but to myself, absorbing the intimate, familiar tone of her final letter to me. Daniel tried to lean in, his curiosity battling his rage, but I tilted the card away. The contents, whatever they were for me alone. A final, private conversation with Evelyn. The reading had begun. My fingers trembled slightly as I held the single, thick card I'd pulled from the blue envelope. The paper carried Evelyn's faint, familiar scent, a sophisticated blend of cedar and jasmine. Daniel, unable to contain himself, was practically vibrating with barely suppressed aggression, leaning in just beyond the reach of my elbow. I began to read, shutting out the tension in the room and letting Evelyn's voice, her final written voice, speak only to me. "My dearest Mark, I know you're only reading this because you remembered. Thank you. It was a good memory, wasn't it? Our life together wasn't perfect, but those early days, before the money, before the lawyers, they were the best. And I know Daniel is probably standing over your shoulder right now, furious, convinced you're about to get the farm, or at least a significant chunk of it. He's always been prone to entitlement, that boy. Don't worry, Mark. You won't get the farm. Not exactly. Remember that locket you sold? It was the key to more than just a memory. When I tracked it down and bought it back 10 years ago, I had a secret compartment installed in it. Inside that compartment is a small slip of paper, an old promissory note. It's the original note for the $34,000 loan you gave me 25 years ago, the seed money that launched my very first real estate deal. The loan I paid back with interest a year later, just as I promised. Except, on the back of that note, I recently wrote one word and signed it, repaid. I paused my reading, confused. I looked up. Daniel, seizing the opportunity, snatched the card from my hand, his eyes scanning the elegant script rapidly. A repaid loan note? Daniel scoffed, utterly bewildered. He threw the card back onto the table, his earlier panic evaporating into sheer indignation. This is it? A final personal bequest is a piece of paper for $34,000 that was paid off 2 decades ago? She made a farce of the will just to give him a worthless piece of sentiment. He turned to Mr. Harrison, his voice incredulous. Mr. Harrison, my mother left a $34 million estate. This is a joke. A cruel, pathetic joke designed to mock me and waste everyone's time. I ignored Daniel and retrieved the card, my mind racing. Evelyn was a master strategist. She never wasted effort. This had to mean something more than sentimental value. The word, repaid, was too deliberate. I turned the card over, and there, written in the very last line, was the key. This entire spectacle, the locket, the password, the drama, was the most expensive, elaborate, and perfect way I could think of to tell our son to mind his own damn business. Now go open the locket, and then go enjoy your modest stipend. Love, Evelyn. Daniel, having leaned in to read the final insult over my shoulder, stumbled backward. His initial rage was now mixed with a simmering feeling of betrayal. Evelyn had used her final legal document not to disinherit, but to publicly troll her son and ex-husband in one masterful stroke. She did this for that? Daniel spluttered, running a hand through his perfectly combed hair. To make me think he was getting something, only for it to be a piece of sentimental junk? This is insane. Mr. Harrison permitted a tiny, dry cough, clearly fighting amusement. Mrs. Jenkins was certainly a woman who appreciated theatrics, Daniel. However, she did specifically instruct Mr. Jenkins to open the locket as the final part of the bequest. The note is inside. All eyes turned to the heavy silver locket resting on the table, a trinket now imbued with incredible significance, waiting to reveal its final and potentially more serious secret. Daniel was still spluttering, railing against Evelyn's final joke, demanding to know if this entire spectacle was just to get a rise out of him. She wasted a lawyer's afternoon, my afternoon, for a sentimental note she already repaid, he fumed, running a trembling hand over his face. Mr. Harrison, having regained his composure, gently steered the proceedings back on track. As I stated, Daniel, Mrs. Jenkins was very specific about the next step. The note, the worthless piece of sentiment, as you call it, is inside the locket. Mr. Jenkins, please open it. I picked up the heavy silver locket. It was tarnished but warm in my palm, a simple, antique design that held a decade of our early life within it. I ran my thumb over the casing, remembering how Evelyn used to fret about losing it. After a moment of careful inspection, I found the tiny, nearly invisible seam Mr. Harrison had mentioned. I pressed it firmly, and with a soft, audible click, the secret compartment sprang open. Inside, tightly folded, was the slip of aged paper. I unfolded it carefully. It was the original promissory note I had written out for Evelyn on the night I lent her the seed money, dated almost 25 years ago. The amount, handwritten in my younger, more optimistic script, clearly read, $34,000. I flipped the note over. On the back, in Evelyn's bold, modern hand, was the single, infuriating word Daniel had read on the card, repaid. Daniel, desperate to confirm the final, humiliating joke, snatched the paper again. See? It's meaningless. It proves nothing other than she's gone completely senile and vindictive. As Daniel was about to crumple the note in sheer frustration, his daughter, Clara, a sharp economics graduate, intervened. She reached out and smoothed the paper flat, her eyes scanning the entire document with professional curiosity. "Wait, Grandpa Daniel, look closer," she murmured, her voice laced with sudden confusion. "The front is the original loan for $34,000. But the signature on the back, it's recent. And there's more than just repaid." Daniel snatched the note back, his eyes racing across the lower portion of the aged paper. Below the single word, repaid, and Evelyn's flourish of a signature, there was a final, meticulously written line, dated just weeks before her death. This deed is fully satisfied by the transfer of 100% ownership of the building at 1234 Park Avenue, NYC. All keys and deeds are held by Mr. Harrison, as per instruction. A stunned, absolute silence descended. The atmosphere changed instantly from one of comedic vindication to devastating shock. The address, 1234 Park Avenue, NYC. I knew it immediately. It was one of the crown jewels of the Carmichael Development's portfolio, a beautiful, 5-story commercial property. It was Evelyn's very first major acquisition, the one that had solidified her reputation and launched the empire. She never sold it, holding it as a trophy asset. Daniel's face went ghastly white, the blood draining away entirely. He crumpled the note in his hand this time, not in anger, but in sheer, visceral panic. That building is worth at least $12 million, he whispered, the huge figure sounding utterly enormous in the sudden quiet of the room. She signed over a $12 million property for a $34,000 loan that was already paid off 2 decades ago? He spun on Mr. Harrison, his voice rising to a shriek. Mr. Harrison, this is clearly coercion. It's undue influence. A $12 million asset for a symbolic debt. It's a fraudulent, massive gift disguised as a debt repayment. It invalidates the terms of the will. I stood there, still holding the locket, utterly speechless. I hadn't prepared for a stipend, let alone the equivalent of a small commercial skyscraper. Evelyn's strategic mind had engineered a loophole of staggering value. She hadn't left me anything new, she had simply settled an old debt with interest, an interest payment totaling over $11.9 million. The silence that followed Daniel's shriek was finally broken, not by the lawyer, but by a sound that made every head snap toward the source. Mr. Harrison, the thin, gray, impeccably controlled estate lawyer, suddenly let out a loud, genuine, and absolutely booming laugh. He threw his head back and laughed until tears welled in his eyes, covering his mouth to stifle the overwhelming mirth. He was laughing at the sheer, beautiful audacity of Evelyn's final masterstroke. Mr. Harrison's laughter was infectious, a genuine, deep, chest-shaking sound that was impossible to ignore. It was the first moment of true, unscripted emotion in the entire dry reading of the will, and it was entirely at Daniel's expense. The lawyer finally managed to stifle his mirth, wiping a tear from the corner of his eye as he looked across the table at a sputtering, defeated Daniel. Mr. Harrison, control yourself. Daniel shrieked, his voice raw with panic and indignation. This is a serious matter. A $12 million asset. We will contest this transfer of the Park Avenue building on grounds of coercion, legal technicality, fraud, anything. He was supposed to get nothing. I told him so. I told him he would get absolutely nothing from my mother's $34 million will. I stood there, still holding the locket, the $12 million note now crumpled in Daniel's furious fist. I finally understood the brilliance of Evelyn's plan. She hadn't made a large, legally dubious gift. She had created a pre-existing, documented debt and then paid it off with an asset transfer, effectively circumventing the will's main distribution and, most importantly, insulating the transaction from her son's entitlement. Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his laughter replaced by a sharp, lawyerly finality. He tapped the top line of the crumpled promissory note, then looked directly at Daniel. Daniel, perhaps you should be more precise in your choice of words, the lawyer said, a trace of residual amusement still playing on his lips. Your father didn't get nothing from your mother's $34 million will. He picked up the note and smoothed it out one last time, pointing to the original loan amount I had written. He got exactly the amount you said he would get. He got the $34 million, the original $34,000, multiplied by 350. Your mother had a very peculiar and very expensive sense of humor when it came to settling old debts of principal. Daniel seemed incapable of responding, his gaze fixed on the $34,000 figure that had cost him a $12 million property. Mr. Harrison then paused for a solemn moment, clearing his throat for the final instruction. Furthermore, he said, his voice dropping to a serious, almost conspiratorial tone, Mrs. Jenkins's will has a final, unwritten addendum that she specifically asked me to deliver to you verbally, Daniel. This is the real purpose of this entire exercise. Daniel glared, waiting for the final shoe to drop. The lawyer smiled faintly, delivering the ultimate message of the estate reading. The lawyer laughed and said, Your mother said to tell you that for every moment you made your father feel unwelcome, small, or irrelevant over the last 20 years, she multiplied his eventual gift by 1,000. She knew you wouldn't be able to resist gloating on the phone and in this room. Congratulations, Daniel. You got your father a $12 million building. This is the cost of your arrogance. The weight of the lawyer's words crushed the last vestiges of Daniel's composure. He realized his own cruelty had directly resulted in this staggering loss. The $12 million transfer was a karmic tax on his entitlement, enacted from beyond the grave by the one person he couldn't argue with. I finally looked at my furious, defeated son, his eyes burning with accusation and self-loathing. I felt no triumph, only a quiet, profound understanding of Evelyn. She hadn't done this out of love for me or hatred for Daniel. She had done it for justice, a final, perfectly structured correction of her son's character using the only language he truly understood, money and loss. I reached into my pocket and tucked the heavy silver locket securely away. My silence was the final, definitive word. I simply nodded to Mr. Harrison, turned, and walked out of the opulent office, leaving my son to grapple with the enormous, priceless, and utterly final joke his mother had played. What do you think Mark should do with the $12 million property now that he owns it? Should he sell it, keep it, or use it to help Daniel, despite everything? The heavy silver locket felt surprisingly warm in my palm, a quiet counterpoint to the pandemonium Daniel was now creating. Evelyn hadn't just left me a $12 million building. She had delivered a final, devastating lesson to her arrogant son, weaponizing his own cruelty against him. The wealth was shocking, yes, but the true prize was the vindication, the silent, profound satisfaction of watching the lawyer deliver Evelyn's last word, turning Daniel's gloating prophecy of nothing into a personal financial catastrophe for him. I stood up, tucking the locket into my suit pocket, the memory of Evelyn's sharp humor now sharper than any of Daniel's insults. I walked away from the opulent office, leaving my humiliated son to process the incredible cost of his arrogance. The question now was, what do I do with this inheritance, this final, enormous joke that Evelyn had so perfectly engineered? Do I keep the building as a trophy of principle, use it to ensure my quiet comfort, or perhaps find a way to honor the spirit of Evelyn's final, complex act of justice?